Welcome, lovely listeners, to SoulStirred, stories of growth and the human experience. I'm Emily Garcia.
And I'm Casey Clark.
We will be your guides on this journey. We are so glad you are here.
Each week, we'll come together, sometimes with other incredible thinkers, creators, and adventurers, to generously share stories of self-discovery, recovery, triumph, and what it means to live a life on purpose.
No matter where you are in your own journey, connection is here for you at SoulStirred.
Settle in, take a deep breath in, and let's inspire each other.
Welcome to SoulStirred. Welcome back, SoulStirred listeners.
It's so good to be with you all here again today. We want to start by giving a bit of a trigger warning. If you're listening to today's episode, we will be talking about the topic of childhood sexual abuse and the effects that that has on people who it may be happening to, as well as the people who love the people that it's happening to or has happened to. So if this is a troublesome topic for you, permission to take really good care of yourself and stop listening now or get support and come back and listen when you have support available to you. You may have heard in SoulStirred's episode 1, Emily and I both shared our early childhood trauma stories of both of us having experienced sexual abuse in our childhoods. Today, Emily, in a most courageous way, is going to share with all of you the sort of extraneous impact. When something like this happens to us, it doesn't just happen to us. It affects us and all of the people who love us and that we are in family with. And so we thought we would open this container and discuss some of those implications. How perpetrators of sexual abuse find their way into families where there are victims ready to be victimized, how they set the ground conditions for victimization to happen, and then the lifelong effects that that has on both the people that they harm and the people in their families. So, Emily, thank you for being willing to break free from the silence and share how that unfortunate event in your childhood or events have affected you throughout life and how they've affected your relationships with your family. So I just want to acknowledge how incredibly brave this is, that you're willing to open this part of your heart for the sake of yourself, one, and for anybody out there who might be listening that has either had an abuse history or maybe knows someone who's had an abuse history or where abuse could currently be happening to a person or people in their family. So thank you for being here today and being willing to do this.
Thanks, Casey. You know, this is one of these things that so many people experience sexual abuse, and there's so much shame around it.
Yeah.
When you are the victim of sexual abuse, it feels like I don't want to tell people because what if they think differently of me? And then what happens is shame is kept in the dark and it just festers and it becomes something that's really heavy that you carry around when you've already been the victim. So when we thought about doing this episode, my goal was to be brave and share my own story so that other people can feel like they can be brave and share as well, because you don't want to allow it to fester. You want to put shame into the light, the story into the light, so it no longer has shame attached to it. It doesn't belong to the victim.
Yeah. To hide out in dark spaces, and it festers and grows when it stays in the dark. And what it can't stand is the light of day to be spoken. And so this really is a moment where you really get to free yourself from some of that shame and reclaim your power. And let's send that shame back to where it belonged in the first place, which is to the person who harmed you. Right? We know that sexual abuse affects 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys. So 25% of the women in the world and 20% of the men in the world have had an experience like this. And one of the things that I think is really remarkable and hopefully really helpful to our SoulStirred audience is to understand the effects of sexual abuse continue. It's not like a moment in time. Um, the things that happen and the way that the people who perpetrate it set up the conditions for it to happen change the wiring in our neurological system. And then
Mm-hmm.
those of us who have experienced trauma like this carry that new wiring into all of our future relationships. And so it's really not a one and done kind of event. It's a thing that
Mm-hmm.
happens that changes who we are and how we show up in life. And what you're doing here today, to me, I have so much respect for you. This is really a moment to reclaim who you were and who you are before any of this
Yeah.
happened. So, share with us a little bit like where the story for you begins and how this man came to be a part of your family.
I was little, so there are a lot of things that I don't remember. I've heard stories from other family members, or I've kind of created like a timeline on my own. But my parents separated when before I could remember. I was a baby,
Mhm.
and my dad moved out, and there was my mom left alone with 4 children. She's a single mom, and she was really struggling financially, struggling emotionally. She was an only child, and so didn't have siblings. She had just my grandma, who also lived locally. And to top it all off, when her and my dad were together, they had some substance use issues. And so she started going to CA, Cocaine Anonymous meetings, and AA, Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. And it was at an AA meeting where she met the man that she would later marry. He was, I believe, he was unemployed. He was an alcoholic, and he had 4 children of his own. And he was looking for an easy victim. He was looking for a woman who was distracted because she had so much going on. And my mom was the perfect victim. And here we were. I'm the youngest of 4 children, vulnerable and didn't have a lot of control. So I don't know how long it took, but he convinced her that he should move in with us. And he moved in and drank a lot and chain smoked and became such a big part of our lives. And I do know that one of the things that he would say and that became my belief was that without him, we would be out on the streets. That he was the reason why we had a roof over our head. And he was the reason why we had food on our table. And so I'm sure he had convinced my mom of the same, even though she was working long, long days and she wasn't around. And so he was in the home alone with us, alone with me.
Under the guise of I'm the provider.
Yeah.
You all need me. Without me, you would maybe not have a roof over your head or food on your table because your mom is single, struggling in poverty with 4 kids. She can't get
Mm-hmm.
by. So I'm here to take care of. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I think he had labeled himself the White Knight. And yet, this is accompanied by that is that he moved into the home and brought his 4 sons who were not okay. They weren't people who were doing well. And so there were suddenly 8 children in our home. And he was spending money on alcohol and cigarettes.
So his 4 children were still with him and they all moved into your home where there were already 4 children and your mom?
Yes.
So just talk about that, like before we even get into the content of the abuse that we're going to be referencing, talk about just the dynamic of that. All of the sudden you have 4 boys, and when you say they're not okay, what does that mean?
Yeah. They were kids who were not going to school. They were ranged in age from I think about 4 years older than me to 12 to 15 years older than me. And so the oldest, he wasn't there for long. He had a different mom. The other three were in trouble legally a lot. They weren't going to school. They would do things to intimidate and mess with my siblings and I. They just were just kind of, I don't have a better word for it other than gross people.
Yeah. And it sounds a little
Yeah.
like terrorizing.
Yeah. It was a very terrorizing time in life.
Yeah. It sounds like it.
Yeah.
Do you know what your mom was perceiving at the time? Or like how it looked? Because surely, let's just put a disclaimer out there, right? Surely she wasn't thinking, let me invite this man and his four terror children into my home to sexually abuse my daughter or my daughters. She must have been thinking something
Mhm.
else. So, what do you remember, or what have you been told about what was going on for her at this
Yeah.
time?
I don't actually know a lot from her, but she has told me that he really weaseled his way in,
Mm,
that she wasn't interested
mm,
in him. But and I don't remember the whole story, but that he gave her a good reason that he needed to be there to help her.
mm-hmm.
And so he got his way in and just brought the kids along.
Yeah,
I don't think that it was evident that they were going to be there
yeah.
initially, but they also had a mom who was struggling. She had her own issues and they couldn't be with her.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
they ended up with
Mm-hmm.
us.
So we can assume from that she felt manipulated at some level if he weaseled his
Probably.
way in, which can be as simple as, I like you and you can't afford to make it on your own. So it could make so
Mhm.
much more sense for us to cohabitate and I'll help you pay the bills. Like it's, when I just want to give some like credence to your mom that when you are in a survival mode in your life and you're really in a place of struggle where you don't know how am I going to feed and house my children,
Mhm.
choices that may otherwise be something you might turn your head away from somehow now seem appealing,
Yeah.
because we're talking about meeting the basic needs of
It's
any.
about survival
Yes.
at that point.
Yeah.
I don't think that she was thinking about thriving. That was nowhere near the realm of possibility. It was like, we need food and we need shelter.
Hmm.
And maybe if this man comes into the home, we'll have that.
Yeah. And
So I'll do it.
she grew up at a time where that's what women were taught to believe, right? If I can't make it
Hmm.
on my own, it's because I need a man provider. I need a
Yes.
husband who has a good job while I care for the children. And it sounds like she was working, but the culture at the time of men and women in society were women took care of the home and men took care of the work and the bills. And what am I going to do
Hmm.
without my husband? Those are questions
Oh,
that I
yeah.
think we still ask ourselves today, women who are going through divorce. Can I make it on my own without the man
Hmm.
counterpart here to take care of me?
Yeah.
And it also sounds like some part of you felt like he maybe had some intention or consciousness that he was coming into a home where there were young girls available.
Hmm. He absolutely did. And I can say this from being an adult
Mm-hmm.
who understands how perpetrators groom
Mm-hmm.
and how they look for victims, but there's never just one victim.
Mm-hmm.
People who commit sexual crimes often have dozens and dozens of victims before they get caught, if they ever get caught. And it goes on for
Mm-hmm.
decades so often. And so I, once the sexual abuse came out, I learned about many people. There were multiple women that I learned about, girls I learned about. But as a child, I had no idea. I thought it was just me. And I thought that there was something wrong with me, that he had chosen me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's those sounds of shame we referenced at the top,
Hmm.
right? That when
Right.
it's happening to you, you believe you're the only one and that it's
Yeah.
because something is bad or wrong or broken about you. And then you
Hmm.
think, I need to hold this dirty little secret because
Yeah.
it must not have happened to anybody else. And it felt dirty to me. And that must make me dirty, and people won't want me if they think I'm dirty, so I'll just hold it and stay quiet about it.
Yeah,
And yet you learn in the case of him, that was totally not the truth.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But you don't know that until you're out of it. And really, it took so much therapy. And I can tell you later about an experience I had where I faced some perpetrators alongside my
Mm-hmm.
therapist that really helped me to see that it hadn't been me.
Yeah.
That it is a crime of
Mm-hmm.
convenience. Like, who is the most convenient victim? Oh, this little girl who's just available right here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A crime of convenience and a crime of circumstance, where
Yeah.
what we know from research in this realm is that perpetrators of sexual abuse actually seek out conditions and circumstances where there are vulnerable children, and what they are trying to set up as the circumstance or the ground conditions is so that they can reoffend. And so they do this process. You referenced this word called grooming, where it's like a preparatory process of both the victims and the other caregivers, where they install manipulations to create the circumstances for them to abuse and re
Mm-hmm.
abuse because they want it to happen more than once. Which is why they say things to their victims like, don't tell anybody. They'll think that you're a bad little girl if you tell anybody. And doesn't this feel good to your body? Things like that, because they want to be able to come back and do it again and again.
Right.
And all of this, as I repeat it back to you about your own story, I can hear the crazy making in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like he's in a role that is pseudo parent, right? So a person in a position of trust
Mm-hmm.
saying things to you that sound to me like, you should be grateful that I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
You have a home because I'm here. You have food in your belly because I'm here. And so for your
Yeah.
little, making sense system to make sense of that, how am I to feel grateful for a person who has me feeling so confused and
Yes.
victimized?
And as you say that, I don't know what he said, but I felt like I was a willing participant.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow I had been convinced that it was a 50-50 situation. And I have a memory of saying to him, I don't think we should do this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It could hurt my mom. I don't think we should do this. And he was like, he just had wide eyes. And then he left me alone for 2 weeks. And I remember the 2 weeks of going, oh, maybe that worked.
Yeah.
But then
But then,
it was like, kind of like a domestic violence perpetrator.
mm-hmm.
As soon as something, shit hits the fan,
Mm-hmm.
there's a honeymoon
Yeah.
period and then it starts up
Yeah.
again. So a similar pattern.
Yeah. So in his mind, we can make up, he's thinking, maybe I shouldn't do this. So he lays off for a
Right.
couple of weeks. You feel like maybe you did have the power to create change. And then
Mm-hmm.
back he comes to harm again.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Like in the case of a domestic violence victim, where I'm going to hit you tonight, send you flowers tomorrow, be kind to you
Mm-hmm.
for a few days, and then you're never going to know when the next hit is coming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what do you remember happening next for you in this version of your story?
Yeah. Well, the years went on, and as I said, I'm the youngest of four.
Mm-hmm.
And so my sister closest to me in age is 4 years older.
Mm-hmm.
Then I have a sister who's 8 years older, and then my brother is 10 years older.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, I don't know when, his sons no longer lived with us. And my siblings started moving out.
Mm-hmm.
So I was 7 when my brother moved out and went to college. And then Lottie, my oldest sister, a couple of years later, she moved out. And then my sister, who's closest to me in age, she moved out. And so I was there alone.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm 15. And I am so boy crazy. I mean, to say that I am boy crazy is almost an understatement. I felt like I needed boys to want me.
Mm.
And I wasn't super sexually promiscuous, but I wanted sexual attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I was home alone with him. And by the way, the type of sexual things that occurred don't always stay the same. As I got older, I think he got a little bit more scared of me.
Mm.
And so the type of behavior would change, like, peeking in my windows. So it was like maybe I wouldn't know kind of thing. He refused to put blinds on my windows and that kind of thing. So there was no way for me to hide.
Mm.
But I would be home alone with him. And at that point, my mom was catering. So she was working at night and I was home with him.
Mm-hmm.
And one night, I don't know what happened. I had a sort of like an on and off boyfriend, and I had been on the phone with him, and then the stepfather, I guess you could call him. I don't like to give him any name because he's nothing to me, but for the sake of understanding who it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, the stepfather came downstairs and said, "You need to get off the phone." And so I hung up, and shortly after that, I thought, it's time for me to tell. So I called the boyfriend and I said, I have to tell you something. And I told him on the phone, and I don't know how he had a cell phone at the time. It was like when you were paying per minute.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, can I call 911? I'm going to call the police. And I was like, no, I don't think you should do that. And then he was like, I think I should do it. And I was like, okay. And so he called 911 on three-way as I sat in the dark in my room, and the stepdad came down the stairs. He knew I was on the phone again, and he stood in front of me in the dark and just stood there and waited. And I, kind of in a trauma response, like it was a fight or flight or freeze, I froze. I just went silent. And finally, my boyfriend said, if he's in front of you, sniffel.
Mm.
So I sniffled.
Mm-hmm.
And then he said, the police are on their way. Sniffle if you hear me. Mm-hmm. And I sniffled. And we had this kind of conversation. And finally, the stepdad said, I'm going upstairs. You need to hang up the phone and come talk to me. Mm. And it felt like an eternity. He called 911 back, and we stayed on the phone with the operator. And she said, they're pulling into your driveway right now. And then I heard a knock at the door. Mm-hmm. And I threw the phone down and ran up the stairs. And as the police came in, and the stepdad was backing up down the hall with his hands up, and he said, I was just telling her to get off the phone. It was a curfew. Mm. And they were coming toward him, and they said, go out on the front porch. Mm-hmm. And so I sat on the front porch. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to add this part in. I also had my boyfriend call Lottie. Mm. Lottie lived across town. Mm-hmm. And she then pulled up in the driveway like seconds after the police had gotten there. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a funny part of the story. She had a really bad haircut that day. And said when she got the call, she had been in the mirror, like agonizing about her hair, but she didn't even remember the drive over. She immediately got the call and flew across town. I mean, she drove so fast that she was able to get there by the time the police arrived. Wow. And so she sat with me on the porch, and the way that they did the like interview at that point was not to like do anything in the evening. Mm-hmm. It was the next day at, what was it, the Family Crisis Center?
Yeah,
is
that
what
Child
it was
Advocacy
called?
Center.
Yeah, Child Advocacy Center, yeah. So the police are there. My mom gets home. She pulls into the driveway, and she has no idea what's going on. There are 2 cop cars with lights on, and we tell her, and my mom says, I just want you to know I believe you. Mm. And then we went in and packed a bag, and they sent me to Lottie's house for the night, where I could be safe for the night. Mm-hmm. But he wasn't arrested. He stayed home with her. And that night, he convinced her that I had been lying.
Wow.
So when I went in for the interview the next morning, I had my interview with the detective and a caseworker. And then they interviewed my mom and they interviewed my sister, and, you know, they did all of the interviews, and then they brought me back in and they said, your mom thinks that it was actually a teacher who abused you. And a side note is I had had a fourth and fifth grade teacher who just that year, earlier in the year, it had come out that he had sexually abused girls. He had been caught.
Oh, wow.
And he used to come to my house. We had a dark room for developing black and white photos in our basement, and he would come and develop photos. And sometimes I would help him. He had never abused me, fortunately. But I said, no, he didn't. He was not the perpetrator. He did that to other people. The person who did it to me was my mom's husband. And they said, you're not safe to go home. You can't go home. So we are going to take you somewhere where you're safe. And they both apologized to me. The detective took me to his car and he said, I'm so sorry. I have to do this. And they took me to a girls' home. And as we drove there, I felt like I was being punished for what had happened. We arrived at this girls' home, and there was a social worker. All the girls were, it was a home where it was mostly girls who were runaways, and they would have them go to school during the day, so they were all gone. And the social worker saw me and immediately was like, what are you doing here? And she said, let's go for a walk. She took me for a walk, and she took me to 7-Eleven and bought me a Slurpee. And she said, I'm not allowed to do this. I'm not supposed to take you out of the house, and I'm not supposed to buy you anything, but I want you to know that I see you. I couldn't even drink the Slurpee. I was so devastated. So I end up in this home, and the girls come home later in the day, and they all walked in and went, what are you doing here? You know, I'm like this little white girl, and I look so innocent. And they right away were like, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. They were very sweet to me. Yeah. Very, like, just sweet girls who were also hurting and acting out in a different way because they were hurting. And I just cried and cried and cried for 3 days straight. And meanwhile, the pipes burst in the home. And so there was like liquid in the air. It was humid, and I basically got pneumonia. Oh. Like, I was in such emotional devastation, and that happened. But after 3 days, my brother and my sister, my brother who's 10 years older and Lottie who's 8 years older, they were able to convince the court to let me go home with them. And the agreement was that Ben, my brother, and his girlfriend, they were pregnant with my nephew. The agreement was that I would go with them, and then Lottie would work on getting kinship foster status to take me in. She lived with roommates, so she had to find a place to live for the two of us. So, and I don't know if I said this, but I was 15. Yeah. So I go home with Ben and my sister-in-law, and I'm just so sick. I mean, I was like devastatingly sick. And after just over a month, Lottie found an apartment and was able to find a place for us to move in together. My other sister took her spot in the house where she had lived with roommates, and everyone shifted around. Yeah. And Lottie became the 23-year-old mom of a really traumatized 15-year-old.
Oh, to unpack in what you've just said with where you're at right now, which is in the emotional devastation of having finally told the truth, and then feeling like you're the one that has to be excommunicated from the family because of it.
Right.
Into a home for basically delinquent young girls.
Yeah, because no one wants teenagers. There aren't soft, loving foster homes that want teenagers.
Yeah. Well, teenagers are hard. They're trying to
trying
to establish their own independence in life. right? As was the case with you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
my heart hurts with you. And I also can relate with the detective who said, I'm so sorry that this is the best the system has for you because we can't leave you here with this man
Yeah.
who's been abusing you sexually, and you have to go somewhere else. And while we all figure out what it is we're doing, it's going to be this place that you feel like you don't fit and you don't belong.
Yeah.
And then, thank goodness for the kindness of those other girls that both worked there and were residents there, who saw that you were someone who didn't belong in that kind of setting and treated you with kindness and compassion. Go back just a little and see what you remember or what you know, maybe from hindsight, about why do you think, you know, it was that night and that
Mm-hmm.
boyfriend in your life and that all of the other siblings had left the home. Like, why that day do you think was the
Yeah.
day that you found your voice?
I have thought about that so many times. And I don't know if I was being led
Mm-hmm.
by something bigger than me. However, I do think, well, we were talking about teenagers are hard. I was kind of like, fuck you. I'm not going to do what you said. Like, that was sort of the feeling I had where I was like, you don't get to tell me what to do anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the motivation, like the energy behind saying, yeah, okay, call 911.
Yeah. Yeah. And, from a psychological, emotional standpoint, I could also make up a story where it's like, and now I've got a boyfriend. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
another male counterpart in my life who cares about
Mm-hmm.
me in a way that doesn't feel like harm.
Yeah.
Therefore, I trust him more than I have ever trusted you, mom's husband. I already have the intuitive sense to know that he's good for me and you're not.
Yeah.
Right? Because our bodies tell us that truth energetically when we're in the space of people who actually have the good, look out for the good in us and those who want to use the good in us to harm us. We can feel that
Mm-hmm.
difference. And good for him at
I
15
know.
years
Well, the
old.
irony is he was a delinquent.
Well,
This kid, but he wasn't a sexual
right.
perpetrator.
The
He was a kid
delinquent,
who
but not a
like,
sex abuser, though there's discernment there, right? I might ditch class and maybe I stole some things from 7-Eleven or something, but I'm not a sexual
yes,
abuse perpetrator on children who I'm supposed to have trust me. And
exactly.
this, what she's
Yeah.
telling me, is wrong. Good
Right.
for him
Right.
for being willing to pick up the phone and be brave enough to call 911.
Yeah.
That's a big
Yeah.
deal for a 15-year-old to go, she just told me the truth and I believe her.
Mm-hmm.
And someone needs to make the authorities aware.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's amazing.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, what happens next for you?
Well, fortunately, the stepfather was arrested
Mm-hmm.
and he was charged with, oh, I wish I could remember exactly, but um, he was charged with sexual abuse by a person in a position of
Mm-hmm.
trust, sexual abuse with a pattern over time, and then there was a third charge,
Mm-hmm.
and he went to jail. I don't exactly know when he was arrested.
Mm-hmm. Because you didn't live there anymore.
Yeah, I didn't live there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom went into a really dark
Mm-hmm.
place. She, everything that she knew to be true suddenly was flipped on its head.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, my grandmother, who he had also groomed, he had also convinced her that we needed him. She just couldn't believe it. And so I saw my grandma one time after the disclosure was made,
Mm-hmm.
and she said, "How could you do this to him? He's the reason why you've had food on your table and a roof over your head. How could you do this?" She was so angry with me.
Oh.
And Lottie, who was with me, said, You don't ever have to see her again. You don't need to take that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we left my grandma's house, and that was the last time I ever saw her.
Wow.
And she and my mom were together. And so everyone stopped talking to my mom.
Mm-hmm.
And we began working with the district attorney who was going to prosecute him. And at that point, there was a statute of limitations for sexual abuse, and you needed to have clear memories.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what went into it, but I had a very clear memory from the night before Halloween when I was in 5th grade and I was 10 years old. And that became a big thing
Mm-hmm.
in our case. But he pled not guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went to trial. He chose a judge and not a jury because he thought a judge would side with him or understand and not give him as harsh of a punishment.
Mm-hmm.
But I testified against him in court, and he was given an 18-year sentence.
Wow. Good for you.
Yeah. I had been going to therapy as part of all of this. There was victims' compensation money,
Mm-hmm.
and I started seeing Fran, who I always talk about. Fran, she's the reason why I became a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
I love her, and she was so important to me. As Fran and I were working together, she said, Emily, I want to prepare you because most often when men are convicted of this, they'll get 6 months of probation.
Mm-hmm.
Don't go into this thinking he's going to get prison time. It's really unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
So my expectations were managed. I hoped for the best, but expected the worst because I thought, well, okay, that's probably what's going to happen. And I don't really have control over that. But somehow it turned out really well. And this is like an interesting thing that happened is the DA who was involved when she won our case. It was such a big deal in her office that there were signs up all over celebrating the, so-and-so case. And later on, she became a judge. And my first job out of college, I was doing case management for adults who had chronic mental illness. And many times they were like in court for petty crimes. And I went to court with a client one time and she was the judge on the stand and she recognized me.
Oh, wonderful.
So, yeah.
Full circle.
Yeah. But there are things like that, the people who were involved throughout the process, through child welfare, through the legal system, people in my family who came out to support. There were just so many people that later on I got to have interactions with them where I was like, you were like this little part of the puzzle that you changed my life.
Yeah.
Like you advocated for me. You stood up for me. You saw that I had potential and that I wasn't what I thought I was. I wasn't this like horrible, gross person because of what had happened to me.
Yeah. Yeah. You're not a horrible, gross person.
Oh no, I don't believe that anymore. But back then,
and
I carried it.
We know how that developing adolescent brain can see all of these circumstances. Grandma's pissed, mom's pissed, stepdad is pissed. Lottie and Ben and Anna are having to rearrange their lives, all because of me. That's how the ego works, right? When in fact, it was all because of him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Completely because of him. Yeah. It was what he created.
Yeah.
And the belief that we have about ourselves, our subconscious about who we are, so much of it is formed before the age of 7. And the abuse started when I was 3. So how I saw myself was really it was really rooted in that. Yeah. And to this day, I have moments where I go, well, is my response to something normal? Or is that because of my childhood? Yeah. Not just things that happened because of him, but so many things where I go, is that normal?
Yeah.
Or is that my childhood?
Yeah. Well, yeah, the work of my adult life, and I continue to work through it every single day, is knowing which version of myself to trust. When there's been trauma, it is hard to know which version of
Yeah.
yourself is your truth and which is your survival.
Yeah. Which part is truly me?
Yeah. What's the truth about me when I've lived for so many years as a trauma survivor, thinking that you're living in your truth when what you're really living in is the survival of your trauma. This is one of the ways that it continues to affect life and relationships. So you were being manipulated, abused, coerced, mistreated, harmed in some version from age 3 to age 15.
Yes.
And then from 15, your whole world, life, foundation, family, relationships, living circumstances were all disrupted as a result of this. I want to go back to that moment when you were sitting on the stoop with the police in the driveway and your mom came home and she said, and you remember it really clearly, "I believe you."
Yes.
And then after spending the night with him, her version of the story changed. Talk about that, the impact of that on you, because we know that from the work that we do in therapy with people, the moment that a person discloses that they were abused as a child, based on the type of response they get from the people in their life, whether they're believed or not, validated and affirmed or not, can be as harmful as the original abuse itself.
Yeah.
Which I suspect is partly why this stands out so clearly to you, to have her say, "I believe you," and then to have that change 24 hours later. Talk about what that was like for you, what you can remember.
Yeah. When I was a kid, my mom had a bumper sticker. It was yellow and had black writing, and it said, "Believe the children." Because of her own sexual abuse. I don't think she ever told my grandma. It was her own father. And she had gone to a women's group, and I think that the bumper sticker came out of that. So when she had that response, it felt like, yeah, okay, good. There were two things that were happening. Is there was my mom's response and there was Lottie's response. And Lottie became she became my mother figure.
Yeah.
And Lottie was just in it. She leaned in, which helped. And so much about how I feel about the situation, the good parts of it are because of her, and because of her and my other siblings. But the next day when the detective and caseworker said, "This is what your mom said," I was in shock. I couldn't believe that she would believe him. I couldn't believe it. You don't know who I am? Really? You're going to believe this guy?
Yeah. Yeah.
It was devastating.
Yeah. Denial is a really powerful thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we know that it's one of the mechanisms our brain utilizes to protect us. And given what you've said about your mom, it tracks, right? She was a victim herself who could never speak out and do the
Right.
brave thing you did. And then I'll speak for myself, how it would feel if it were me, not to put words in your mom's mouth, but if I bring a man into the home who then harms my daughter, I can get myself to a place that can understand, how could I not have seen that the person who is supposed to be my intimate and sexual partner is sexually harming my child?
Yeah.
And because that feels like such a catastrophic truth to try to engage in, and the implications of that truth, I can understand how denial can drop in and want to believe his version of the story as a defense mechanism, so that I don't have to feel all of the complicated pain and devastation on the other side of accepting that truth.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, the result of that defense mechanism was that you, her child, got to feel all of that devastation by yourself.
Right.
And feel
Yeah.
as if you owned it or as if it was your fault.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think every single one of us has had a moment in life where there's something that we know is true, but we deny it.
Mm-hmm.
It really is. We can all relate to it. And I think that people want to think like, I would have the right reaction if it were my child.
Mm-hmm. Would you, though?
But we don't know.
We don't
We
know.
don't know.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I think the mama bear in me would come out and I'd probably do something that would land me in prison. But do I know that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
These are hard things.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious. So, you had said in the beginning of the story that part of what created the ground conditions for the abuser to weasel his way into your home was your parents had divorced.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I'm curious, where was dad? Where was Poppy?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
all of this while he's, allowed to hurt you for 12 plus years.
Mm-hmm.
Where was your dad?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we've talked about my dad in this show and how special he was to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I've also talked about how he had different chapters in his life where he showed up very differently.
Mm-hmm.
He was wonderful
Mm-hmm.
for the last 20 years of his life. But prior to that, he wasn't around.
Mm-hmm.
He divorced my mom. He was still using cocaine, selling cocaine,
Mm-hmm.
and he moved away.
Yeah.
He moved to Las Vegas where he met my stepmom and got remarried. And we would visit him. It was like see dad twice a year. Maybe he would come to town. He'd come to Denver and take us out for food and give us a little bit of money. And then he would go back or we would go there. But he wasn't in a fatherly role. He wasn't a present father.
Mm-hmm.
So he ended up getting divorced from my stepmom, who we still love and are in touch with, but they got divorced, I think, when I was 9.
Mm-hmm.
He moved back to Denver and got an apartment. And there was never a question if we were going to live with my dad. He was a man with a good soul.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was clean at that point. I don't know at what point he stopped using and selling drugs, but he had been clean and he was trying to live a good life, but he just was never capable of being a dad.
Mm-hmm.
We did spend more time with him after I was 9.
Mm-hmm.
Anna, my sister, who's 4 years older, and we would go over and stay the night at his house and have weekends there. But when I disclosed everything, he really tried to figure out how he could show up. And I remember looking at a couple of houses that he thought, oh, maybe we can move into. But he financially was a child.
Mm-hmm.
He just couldn't get it together. He was like the kind of person where it was like he always had a business idea, like a visionary spirit, but he couldn't follow through on anything and he never had money. And he showed love through gift giving. So he also, if he didn't have money, he was not around.
Mm-hmm.
He would show up if he could take us to feed us and give us money at the end.
Yeah.
So, he did his best, but that really was a turning point in our relationship because even though he couldn't get it together to financially be a dad, he was around all the time after that. Lottie and I moved into our apartment and I think he drove Lottie up the wall because he was constantly there and, bringing furniture, taking furniture, like, just he was there all the time. So he showed up in the way that he could at that point, which made us a lot closer, but he was not a dad. And as I got older, I was in my 20s and I carried him on my car insurance because it was just the kind of relationship we have where I'd always say, well, I have a, 60-year-old son. It's my dad.
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Sounds like
Yeah.
he spent a lot of his life in a mode of survival too.
Yeah.
And maybe part of the best that he was ever able to move beyond that was to become free of substances.
Right.
And yet that we know that there's so many more layers to the work of adulting, right? To be responsible with time and employment and money and housing and security and stability and things of that nature that some of us don't get to ever really achieve in this lifetime, and he was one of them.
He was one of them. He
Do
was a
you?
good soul, but not an adult.
Yeah. But he
Yeah.
knew about what happened to you, it sounds like.
He didn't know before I disclosed it,
Okay.
but then he did. And at the time, the detective said to him, do not go and do anything, because if he gets a scratch,
Yeah.
you're going to go to jail for it.
Yeah.
And he wanted to kill him.
Okay.
I mean, he was so angry.
So stepdad was not in prison yet at the time that dad learned about.
Yeah.
And so there was really a need to kind of protect one from the other, like don't go kill him for harming your daughter.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And then do you think how he was with you and Lottie, like always around and bringing furniture and doing the best he could? Do you think, are those things related? Like once he
Yes.
heard about what happened to you in his absence, was his sort of overcorrected presence in response? Like I can protect her now.
Interesting. I never thought about it as an overcorrection, but because he showed his love through giving.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a thing he always did. That was for the rest of his life. But I know that he carried a lot of guilt, that he had left his children in a home where we weren't safe.
Yeah.
And he was off doing his own thing. And I know he carried a lot of guilt for that.
Did he talk to you about that?
We had one conversation. It was actually in my mid-30s when I was going through my divorce. And that was another time where he spent a lot of time at my house. He'd bring pizza or, just come over when I was making dinner, but he was there a lot. And we had one conversation when he said, I wish I had been there. I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
He wasn't a deep storyteller or a man of many words in those situations, but
it was felt.
It was felt.
Yeah. And I bet he really meant it.
Yeah.
And again, I can imagine, go rewind back to the point when he decided to divorce your mom. Never in his wildest dreams did it occur to him, maybe she'll go marry someone else who might harm my daughters. He just thought he was getting a divorce. And again, moving on in his next chapter of surviving this thing called the human experience.
Right.
And it's also important to just acknowledge the other fact that's here, that substance use is one of the ground conditions that make children vulnerable to this sort of maltreatment. Because when people aren't present and conscious and paying attention, abusers can see the possibilities in that circumstance. If my wife is too drunk or my partner is too high on coke or whatever, and their child is here, that's an opportunity for me as a perpetrator.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Important about this chapter in your story for you to share today?
I think there are the years after that are really important, because it feels like the before the disclosure and then the after. And at that point, when I moved in with Lottie, I was not caring about school. I was ditching all of the time so I could hang out with boys, and I had failed algebra and I was nearly failing everything else. Like I didn't care. I kind of felt like I'd given up. Nothing mattered. I was not involved in anything in school. And suddenly Lottie was like, you are going to bring home a progress report every single Friday, signed by every single teacher with your grade. And I was like, I hate this, but it was what I needed. I needed structure. I needed someone who loved me enough to hold me accountable. And it wasn't just the grades. It was for the first time in my life where she said, okay, well, you can do drama and stage in school. You can do soccer. You can do volleyball. You can. And so I started getting involved in all these things in school. It was mid-year, sophomore year. I had teachers, one teacher in particular, Mr. Wieland, who was the stage teacher. He created the sets when we had plays and musicals, and he knew what had happened and took me in and was so kind and loving. It wasn't just me. He was like that with so many students. So things shifted because I had places I needed to be and people that were depending on me, you know, like I'm on a team, and I was a terrible soccer player, by the way, but I loved it. Yeah. I enjoyed it. I had fun being out there. Yeah. So I was doing things, and in the process, living with Lottie, we were literally living below the poverty line. Whatever the number was at the time, she was working 3 jobs and barely making it. I mean, I don't know how she did it at 23. Yeah. But she made it happen. And then another thing was she had always been a counselor on these trips that they took 17-year-olds to Israel. It was called the Israeli Studies Tour. She had gone when she was 17, and it's a 6-week trip. She wanted me to go. So I went to the Hebrew school leading up to it, and we got a scholarship and did everything we could to get me there. It was fortunate because she had made amazing connections where people knew what was going on in our family, and someone gave me like $1,000 scholarship, I think through our synagogue. Wow. And I went to Israel for that summer, and that was when I was like, oh, there's so much more to the world. Yeah. It opened my eyes where I was like, I love traveling. This is what I want to do. And going into my senior year, I changed in how I saw friendships. I became really close to 2 of my still very best friends. And I applied for colleges. And although, you know, my GPA wasn't that great because of my sophomore year where I had given up, and I got into a really good college and got really good financial aid because I was a ward of the state. Yeah. So they couldn't use anyone else's income for me.
As it should be. If you spent time in foster care, you have every right to have the government help you get through a college education. Because you know what? So, no one should have to spend time in foster care.
Yeah.
And so those who do, who have this kind of life disruption, whether it's one night or 3 days or 3 years, the government should help you get yourself up and into college.
Exactly.
Yes, I'm a yes for that. And even though I paid for college myself, I think the government should help people who have been in foster care get through college. What I love about this chapter in your story so much is Lottie. It's like she said to you, like she grabbed you by the shoulders and shook you a little bit and said, look, kid, you're not going to let this trauma define your life.
Yeah.
And that's where you're headed right now. But you are alive for so much more than this.
Yeah.
And so we are going to turn this pain into your power.
Right.
Not let you be defined by it. I don't care if it's soccer or volleyball or Israel or Spanish or something else, but this is not going to derail your life.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I don't know how she knew this as such a young adult.
Yeah. Well, she's obviously very, very wise. And we also know that that's the truth, right? It only takes one trusted adult to show up for a kid who is working their way through a very hard thing to help build the resilience that kid needs to change the whole trajectory of their life.
Exactly.
And in your case, you had more than one. I mean, thank God for all of the siblings. Lottie most especially, but also Mr. Whelan and the detective and the group home supervisor who took you out for a Slurpee.
And caseworkers that I had.
And Fran. Like these are
Yes.
the
Yeah.
people who, it's almost like I can see you walking down the moving walkway of your life, right? And you're like just letting it push you towards, because of course you are, it's all you had ever known. You're letting it move you towards trauma and harm and the
Mm-hmm.
deconstruction that happens based on the stories we make up about ourselves when we've been abused by an adult. And then these
Mm-hmm.
other people who show up along the way to just turn you, just get you to pivot just a little bit to the left.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly your
Yeah.
whole life story is down a whole new path.
Yes. The people that orient
Mhm.
you toward a whole other reality that it's not even that you didn't want it, you didn't even know
Yeah.
it was out
Yeah.
there.
Well, you weren't conscious.
No.
You're in a total trauma response, like unconscious spin at this point in your life. Of course you're failing out of school. You were doing the
Mm-hmm.
best that you could to keep your little system and your little body alive after so many years of harm and so much destabilization from talking about it.
Right.
Yeah.
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 It is when we talked about my goal for this episode, I talked about bringing shame out of the
Yeah.
darkness. But also it's a combination of things that if we talk about it, we realize we're not alone
Mhm.
because every one of us either has been or knows someone who has been victimized.
Yeah.
And there is hope that the story, what happens to you, doesn't define who you
Mhm.
are. You get to choose, that we always have a choice, but we don't know it when we're the victim.
Mhm.
And having those people who can give us a different perspective is so important. And this is why, like, as an adult, I think it's so important to choose who you surround yourself with
Mhm.
because the people we are around impact us in more ways than we know because we see ourselves through them.
Yeah. Yeah. So look around right now at like the
Mm-hmm.
6 people you are most closely surrounded by, and you'll get a
Right.
glimpse into the you that you are becoming.
Mm-hmm.
Choose wisely. We attract at the level
Exactly.
that we're at.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to send you all of the love and respect that are pouring through my heart right now
Thank
for
you.
refusing to stay silent and being
Yeah.
willing to take this stand here today with me, with our Soul Stirred audience, to speak the whole truth about how it was for you. Because you now know that it was how it was, not because of you,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Um,
Yeah.
our hope, I know we both feel this so strongly, is that we will affect those of you who are listening, and that maybe somebody out there who's been holding on to a secret and continuing to let it deconstruct your life. Maybe we are reaching our hands in to say, you don't have to be in it alone anymore. It's okay to
Yeah.
speak up, it's okay to speak out. And it was never ours to hold in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't belong to
Mm-hmm.
us, and it doesn't belong to you. So tell someone. We should
Yeah.
say if you are the victim of sexual abuse, or maybe someone close to you that you know or love has been the victim of sexual abuse, please don't hesitate to call your local child welfare child protection hotline and make a report about what you know. People whose job it is to protect children do their job. You don't have to be in this circumstance alone, and you don't even have to know what wants to happen next. You just have to make the call.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any final words from you, Emily?
No, thank you for this.
Thank you for sharing your story with me and with all of us today. I see you and
Yeah,
I
my
admire you.
pleasure. Thank you, Casey.
SoulStirred listeners, thank you so much for joining us today as we bring you stories of growth in the human experience. We appreciate you, and we have a request for you. If you will take 30 seconds to do these 3 things for us. 1, follow or subscribe to SoulStirredPodcast. This makes sure you never miss an episode and helps us to make sure you never miss an episode. Head over to your preferred platform, click the SoulStirred Podcast show page, and click the plus sign or the follow button. Second, we'd love it if you could give us a 5-star rating while you're there. Finally, choose your favorite episode and share it with a friend.
We are so grateful to all of our listeners for your continued support helping SoulStirred grow and ultimately inspire others through authentic connection. Don't hesitate to reach out with ideas, stories, or questions. We are always eager to hear from you. Our email and social links are found in every episode's show notes. Until next time, keep stirring your soul and embracing your journey.
Take good care of yourselves and of each other. Bye-bye.